I firmly believe that Bleach has some of the most impressive world building I've seen from a shonen manga. And that's a pretty unpopular take. If anything, most people think Bleach's world building is average at best. Personally, I think that is the result of a widespread misconception when it comes to the idea of world building. A lot of people don't actually know this, but a story set in the real world like My Hero Academia or Jujutsu Kaisen has world building. There are various different types of world building. You have physical world building, which represents the creation of physical structures like buildings, cities, countries, and even planets. Then there's societal world building, which represents the creation of different communities, cultures, religions, occupations, and lifestyles. When it comes to the settings of fictional stories, there is so much more to consider than just the geography of the world. You need to factor in the science of the universe, the different societies, the politics, even the biology and chemistry depending on the story you're telling. Things like power systems in battle manga fall under the umbrella of world building, and that brings me to my ultimate point. Bleach's power systems are pretty insane. I haven't seen any good videos explaining the several layers that go into the construction of each of the different power systems and how they play into one another. All the different races have their own exclusive power system that ties back to a single fundamental concept, Reiryoku, or spiritual power. Over the next few weeks, I want to make several videos on the different races within the Bleach universe and explain how their power systems work, with the main objective of hopefully making more people aware of just how incredible Bleach's world building truly is. And in order to do so, we have to start by going through the basics. Reiryoku, which means spiritual power but can also be translated to spiritual energy, is a power aligned with the spiritual sensitivity and willpower of the user. Simply put, it's an inherent power that everybody has. Every single living being has a spirit, and this spirit has a power of its own known as Reiryoku. It doesn't matter what race you are, you can be a human, a Quincy, a Shinigami, or a Hollow, you will have some level of spiritual power. It's the amount of spiritual power that you have that obviously determines how powerful you are. On the Bleach wiki, there's a chart that breaks down the different spiritual power levels, taking information found in different bits all over the series. At the very bottom, you have basic spiritual power, which is the level you'd commonly expect from a regular human. These people are not spiritually aware, which means they cannot see other spirits like pluses or hollows. Above this level, you have average spiritual power, which is the level you'd expect from very low-ranking members of the Gotei 13. They are spiritually aware, they can see pluses and hollows, but they aren't really powerful. Think of Ichigo right at the very beginning of the story, before he was stabbed by Rukia. He could see and speak to ghosts and even see Shinigami, but he was pretty weak in the grand scheme of things. Then you have high spiritual power, which is the level you'd expect from the average lieutenant in the Gotei 13. These people have an above average amount of spiritual power and they have fine control over it. Above that is great spiritual power, and this is where we reach the territory of very powerful individuals like Captain Class Shinigami. They have a very large amount of spiritual power. And then we have immense spiritual power, which is a level reserved for those who are advanced Captain Class, people with enormous amounts of spiritual power who can affect their surrounding environment on a controlled level. And finally, we have immeasurable spiritual power, which is a very, very rare class which is only reserved for the strongest beings. People like Kenpachi or Yuhaba, who possess colossal amounts of spiritual power and can do all sorts of things with it. Reiryoku is constantly being subconsciously emitted by every spiritual being, and it always has a unique pattern associated with that specific being. The emission of Reiryoku is known as Reiatsu, which means spiritual pressure. Different races have greatly different patterns of Reiatsu, which means it's easy to distinguish between the Reiatsu of a Shinigami and the Reiatsu of a human or a Hollow or a Quincy. However, if they're the same race, it's a bit harder to distinguish between them, but not impossible. After spending a lot of time with another spiritual being, people can recognize the specific pattern of that person's Reiatsu and use that to sense their presence. Sensing someone else's Reiatsu is seen as a very very basic ability called Reikaku, or spiritual sense. This is considered like a sixth sense for spiritually aware individuals, and it's something that can be honed with training. Sudden changes in Reiatsu patterns can mean that the person in question is in stress, in combat, or has received a grave wound, which can be very useful in war-type scenarios as other people can detect this from far distances. Obviously, the fact that Reiryoku is constantly being emitted as Reiatsu makes you very easily detectable, so of course there are ways to block your Reiatsu and mask your presence. The Seki Seki is a special kind of stone that completely blocks Reiatsu and drains your Reiryoku. The walls of both the Seirete and the Senzaiku are built from this stone, which effectively repels unwanted visitors from the Seirete and prevents the escape of prisoners from the Senzaiku. The madman Orohara has also invented a special garment which completely hides Reiatsu as well. When two spiritual beings collide, the one with weaker Reiatsu will get hurt. We saw this when Ichigo fought against Kenpachi. Kenpachi gave him a free hit on his chest and Ichigo couldn't even scratch him, while his own hands started bleeding. Reiatsu can be controlled for a variety of usages. Some people can amplify their Reiatsu as a show of force or a means of intimidation, and in some cases it can even serve as an attack in of itself, capable of causing direct damage to the surrounding individuals or even the environment. It can also have psychological effects such as stunning, paralyzing, or instilling fear when someone has a much higher Reiatsu in comparison to the one feeling it. Then there's the fact that spiritual beings cannot be sensed by significantly less powerful beings without even needing to conceal their Reiatsu. When they have ridiculous amounts of Reiryoku, they're just like invisible to you because they're just so much stronger than you. We see this when Dangai Ichigo showed up in Karakura Town and Aizen couldn't sense his Reiatsu whatsoever. So let's quickly go over the basic principles of Reiryoku and Reiatsu. Reiryoku is spiritual power that exists in every single spiritual being. It comes in various different amounts depending on the being, and it is stored within their soul. Reiatsu is more of a concept than an actual tangible thing. It is spiritual pressure that is associated with the emission of Reiryoku from a being. Reiryoku and Reiatsu are very closely related. Reiryoku is the actual energy itself, and Reiatsu is the pressure of that energy being emitted. It's like air pressure in the atmosphere. Air pressure isn't an actual thing, but rather a concept we use to understand the flow of the air. Another good analogy for this would be a water tank with a valve. Reiryoku is the water tank itself, including the water within it, and Reiatsu is the pressure of the water flowing out of the valve. This tank is constantly and subconsciously leaking tiny bits of water, which is detectable by any person who can perform Reikaku, the ability that allows someone to sense someone else's Reiatsu. The bigger the tank, the more water it can fit. The more Reiryoku you have, the more Reiatsu you can emit. Got that? Okay, let's move on to the final piece, Reishi, or spirit particles. Reishi is the main component material of souls and all spiritual matter. The bodies of Shinigami and Hollows are composed of Reishi. Everything in the Soul Society and Hueco Mundo is also composed of Reishi. Reishi can also be found in the human world, however the concentrations are much lower than the two spiritual worlds because the human world is composed of a different material known as Kishi, which is essentially what we in the real world would call atoms. Reishi is an invisible and intangible material to non-spiritually aware beings, like the average human, which is why the average human can't see ghosts or pluses, and they can't see hollows or Shinigami. Everyone who is spiritually aware can see and interact with Reishi, and depending on your race, there are different ways you can use Reishi. In the human world, free Reishi tends to be found in places closer to nature, which is something we'll be looking at a little more in a couple of weeks when I make the video about the race of Quincy's. Reishi is very important to their power system and just general livelihood. And with that being said, I think I've covered everything that needs to be said for this video. Hopefully I've laid out just what Reiryoku, Reiatsu, and Reishi mean and what they represent on a fundamental level for Bleach's universe. Over the coming weeks, I'll be making videos on the Shinigami, the Quincy, and the Hollows. And I'll be using those terms quite a bit, so in preparation for that, I wanted to make this video where I fully explain them. I hope you guys enjoyed this one, but honestly it's just a warm up for what's coming. I look forward to seeing you guys next Monday where we dive into everything about Shinigami and explain their power system, from Zanpakuto Zanpakuto to Kido to Hado. Thank you guys very much for watching, and leave a like if you enjoyed.